Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz, Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research, which is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. CESPA tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments, and this program is part of that effort. This episode will discuss the developments in the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war. The war took an interesting turn on August 6th last month when a medium-sized Ukrainian force broke through thin Russian defenses into Russia's Kursk Oblast, which is north of the Russian fortifications in the Donbass and further south. Not Kursk, but further south fortifications. For almost a year, the Russian multi-layered defensive line has seen attritional activity with minor tactical breakthroughs by both sides that have taken a heavy toll of men and material with no real strategic impact. The August 6th invasion into Russia indicates that Ukrainians decided to turn a war of attrition into maneuver war with a surprise incursion. There are many assessments of Ukraine's likely objectives. In tandem with the other bolder attacks into Russia, it is clear that Ukraine decided to take the war into Russia. Destroying bridges over same river indicates the objective of disrupting Russia's line of communication. This is also clear from attacks on Russia's oil refineries and POL depots. And depending on how troops can be rotated and logistics sustained, because ultimately sustainment is at the heart of any war, especially a fit of war. The Ukrainian force could also try to encircle Russian troops in the oblast and occupy more territory. But more than the material losses, the incursion has humiliated Russia. As one analyst noted, this means that Russia cannot carry out one of the most basic functions of government, i.e. security within its own territory. In other words, while Russia has occupied Ukrainian territory, the Ukrainians are now in occupation of Russian territory. Not in the same ratio, but in occupation nonetheless. This also means that for a real effort by Russia to dislodge Ukrainian troops, it will have to move experienced fighting echelons from its defensive line on Ukraine's territory. That could, in theory, provide Ukraine the opportunity to launch the much-needed counteroffensive and regain territory at certain points. That said, there's always a but, and that's what I plan to discuss in this episode. And I'm joined by Dr. Mariana Budjeryn, currently a senior research associate project on managing the atom at Harvard's Belfer Center. Dr. Budjeryn, a military historian and an expert on Russia and Ukraine, is also the author of Inheriting the Bomb, which won the Colby Military Writers Award. With her is Mathew Burrows, who currently serves as counselor in the executive office at the Stimson Center. Mr. Burrows is one of the leading experts on strategic foresight and global trend analysis. In 2013, he retired from a 28-year-long career in the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency, the last 10 years of which he spent at the National Intelligence Council, which is the premier analytic unit in the US intelligence community. Welcome to the program, Mariana. Thank you once again for being on the program. Let me begin with you. This August 6th incursion that seems to have added a new dimension. So there's the attritive dimension that's still going on, where the Russians have dug themselves in, but then now the Ukrainians are operating on Russian soil. They're also attacking deeper into Russian territory through various platforms. How significant do you think this is in terms of going ultimately at some point to the negotiating table?
So let me just begin by saying that it's difficult to judge the full import of this Kursk operation at this point, right? This is still very much a story in the development. And as Bismarck once said, you don't play chess one move at the time, right? So this is just one move of a bigger strategy that we assume the Ukrainian government has in this war. And what this operation has showed us that Ukrainian government can maintain, Ukrainian military and political leadership can maintain a pretty tight operational security. This was a surprise, both for Russia, for the West, and for many in Ukraine as well. It was a pretty tightly held operation and plans. Now, we don't know what Ukrainians still might have up their sleeve, because certainly looking at this operation in isolation, we see that it might have drawbacks for Ukrainians as much as it offer advantages. One thing that I think this operation does accomplish is that, you don't want to fight the war that your opponent wants you to fight.
Correct.
Right? Ukrainians have been now for months drawn into the kind of war that's, I don't want to say beneficial in terms that any war can be beneficial for anyone, but it's a war that Russia kind of imposes on Ukraine. This war of, meat attacks, huge human losses over very small territory in the east. It's this war of unequal resources that Ukraine is bound to be at a disadvantage of. So this was an attempt to shift that narrative of the war, to shift it, to throw a wrench into that plan. And as you said, that continues to be accompanied by reaching further into Russia, into their targeting their oil refineries and critical infrastructure nodes on Russian territory, deeper into Russian territory with Ukrainian drones and unmanned, uncrewed vehicles, aerial vehicles. Sorry. So depending how all of this strategy plays out, I don't see Kursk being kind of a kind of an asset immediately in any upcoming Russo-Ukrainian negotiations, because I don't see that negotiation or any kind of peace settlement coming within the foreseeable future, certainly not within this or perhaps even the next year. But it is an important element in the overall attempt of Ukraine to stop fighting the war that Russia wants Ukraine to fight. And put the Russians, at least in some areas, on their back foot.
Okay. Matthew, you've had a long career at the State Department and also at the Central Intelligence Agency. I'm going to come to one particular assessment that you've written for Red Cell, it's put out by Stimson. But before I get to that, do you agree with Mariana's assessment that this Kursk incursion hasn't really played out yet, and two, that it is too early to say that it could make any significant difference if and when the two sides get to the negotiating table?
No, I share Mariana's analysis. The one element that I would, emphasize and that she mentioned is, I think it was not just intended as a message to Moscow, but also to the West, which has been, I would say, the kind of patience is wearing down, not just in the U.S., where I guess the two of us, Mariana and I, are very familiar with, but also in Europe, where you're hearing, particularly from the Germans, that they're not prepared to make give as much assistance in the coming year. And so I think it was partially meant to show that, there was still life in the Ukraine campaign, and it has, raised the morale of a lot of the Ukraine supporters. I think the besides the Kursk campaign of Ukraine is carrying out, what we also don't know is, we see Russia inching more in Donetsk, and to what degree that is going to, in the next few weeks play out as, actually Russia achieving a lot of its aspirations of controlling all of Donetsk. And as I think you'll share, I mean, when you get into negotiations, the territorial part is the most difficult. And if you possess, or control that, which, it's going to be harder, I think, for Ukraine to get what it wants, is the basically return of all the Russian-controlled territories.
Okay, so this is not exactly a question, more my observation. And I just want to put it on the table and then get your impressions on this. Russia, as you said, is inching forward. But whatever the Russian or the nature of the Russian campaign in the Donbass, the fact that there are Ukrainian troops on Russian soil is a problem that Russia has to solve. I mean, Russia can't just sit pretty and say, okay, we've got X percentage of the Ukrainian territory. So if the Ukrainians want to hold this, a little bit of territory, that's okay. That's not going to happen because, as I said, that humiliates Russia. And so they will have to, at some point, launch some kind of counter, if at all. And as I said in my opening, that seems to, or that would require far more experienced troops in larger numbers, at least a ratio of 1 to 3, for the Russians to actually get that territory vacated. That is, do you think, President Putin has said that about 700,000 Russian troops are operating in the theater. So if that number is correct, then I think Russia has the space to take out, about 3 divisions to start operating in Kursk against the Ukrainian forces and throw them out. Do you think, Matthew, I'll get back to Mariana also on this, but I first want to get your take on this. Do you think that is going to be a priority for President Putin right now in terms of his operational plans?
No.
No. Okay.
There's no pressure on him.
Okay.
His poll ratings are still extraordinarily high if you compare them with politicians and political leaders in the West. But secondly, the Russian economy is growing at 4% annual growth now. So, and you don't have the pressure from, at least there's no evidence of it, from those who have lost their homes, in Kursk. And that isn't getting a bigger resonance in the rest of Russia.
That's an interesting way of putting it. So you think
I think he intends? So let me cover it at some point. But I think what he is really betting on is that they can make enough progress before the winter sets in, and although they also were in Donetsk, that's much more valuable in terms of the longer term negotiations once they will happen.
Okay, but let me put it like this. Because you talked about the growth of the Russian economy, which President Zelensky calls the war economy now. You talked about Putin's numbers in terms of its popularity. If this incursion, and this is a counterfactual, if this had actually impacted President Putin's ratings, do you think that would have turned this into a priority?
I think if the Ukrainians had captured the nuclear facility, there would be a bigger issue and a bigger concern, not just in Russia, but also in Europe, about what could happen. That's particularly the worry about a disaster like Chernobyl.
Okay.
It's a humiliation, no doubt. And I think Putin is probably blaming a lot of people in the military and in the bureaucracy and so on for what happened.
Okay.
And is very angry about it. But he's whether you like him or not, he's a good calculator of risk.
Oh, absolutely. Certainly is.
And he has a high tolerance for it. And at this point, I think he sees that the gains in Donetsk are a lot more valuable than for him in the longer term than just recovering the curse, which he probably assumes will happen at some point anyway. And he's more than willing to sacrifice those Russians who have lost their homes and probably, some of them won't have anything to go back to in Kursk.
Right. I'm sure Mariana has a lot to say about this. So Mariana, go ahead.
I share a lot less certainty about what we think we know Putin, the effects on Putin are. For sure, his ratings are strong, but that's, support ratings in a country like Russia give you some indication, but not all about the strength of the regime. Putin is also reliant on, a certain network of the political military leadership and the money that, that whole vertical of power that he has constructed over the years. And we don't know what stressors this puts, how he presents suddenly as a leader of a country that has lost territory, of all people, to Ukrainians who they even think are contemptuous people to even fight with. They keep maintaining this narrative that they're actually, fighting with NATO and the West indirectly in Ukraine. And suddenly these Ukrainians are occupying parts of the Russian territory. I think it's kind of a big deal for Putin, even though we know that he's smart in the way that he doesn't offer his reactions right away publicly, but in his, KGB FSB way, I'm sure he's scheming of how to deal with the situation. Just remember the Prigozhin story, right? He had this conciliatory, like, no big deal, let's all be friends and not, pull Russia together. And then a few weeks later, the plane with Prigozhin drops down from the sky. So Putin has his different ways, nor do I think this strength apparent of Russian economy is somehow an indication of Russian economic health long term. I mean, they do have problems with inflation. The prime rate is at 18% right now. I mean, they're trying their best under the circumstances for sure. But the economy long term will suffer, and we'll see what is that breaking point for the Russian people. There are indications that Russians are pulling troops from elsewhere to try and put up resistance, not only to stop the Ukrainian advance, but to regain some of the towns. I think even one recently has been regained. It hasn't had an impact on other parts of the front as much as Ukrainians possibly have hoped. So you're right that Donbass and Pokrovsk and Toretsk, they remain priorities for the Russians, and that effort continues, with some success on the Russian side. But again, we don't know the full extent. We got to watch the space very closely, because there will be.
Yeah. So, but Matthew raised a very interesting reference point with reference to the nuclear plant, the reactor. Now, we know that the Russians are in occupation of the Zaporizhia reactor. Is it possible? And you're right, we really don't know too much. But is it possible that the Ukrainians do the same? I mean, we know that the IAEA has And I ask you this because, this is one of your areas of interest. The IAEA has been very concerned about the Zaporizhzhia plant. They're also very concerned about the Kursk reactor. But do you think the Ukrainians, giving the IAEA, in the event that they could physically take over the plant and
No.
give guarantees to the IAEA, but
No.
remain in occupation of that?
No, I
No.
think there isn't. I mean, again, I don't know what Ukrainians' plans are, but that would be A, stupid, B, a huge liability for Ukrainians, right?
Okay.
So even in any kind of calculation, that would be more of a liability than an asset. One is the kind of moral high ground that Ukraine does have now in the nuclear space with the occupation of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and to turn these tables around and become an occupier, to threaten a nuclear facility with military force would lose Ukrainians.
No, I'm not saying threatening. No. Let me clarify. I'm not saying threatening the nuclear facility with military force, but simply, if you reach that area, you have the Russian crews, staff, call it what you will, who are running the plant. They stay there. The IAEA inspection teams come, but the physical security of the area then is in the hands of the Ukrainian troops.
That's a big assumption because, of course, every nuclear facility has National Guardsmen that are charged with protecting it, just like that was the case at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And they took the fight. It's their task to protect this nuclear facility from whoever comes out. So certainly, if it's a Ukrainian army at the door. And what happened in the case of Zaporizhzhia is that battle took place basically at the doorstep of a nuclear power plant. And at that point, your military necessity takes a preference, and there's all sorts of things that could happen. And we decry that in the case of what the Russians did at Zaporizhzhia. It would be really a travesty if Ukrainians went that way. And I'm pretty sure Ukrainians, beyond that, holding the facility in custody is a huge headache. Right? Because you have to have staff rotation. It's like doing that in occupation. We know from Zaporizhzhia that compromises quite significantly safety and security. And I think what the Russians did with Kursk, they do the same thing over and over again. They manipulate nuclear risks. They invited Grossi. Grossi came in and, did his statements, even though he certainly didn't say there's an imminent danger to the plant. But there was a big political show, and the Russians are trying to turn the tables around on Ukrainians now with no evidence that the occupation of the plant is included in Ukrainian war plans.
Okay. Let's just try and move forward now. I know, predictions are very difficult. We are, especially when there's a war going on, there's radical uncertainty. But Matthew spent a very interesting piece, which tries to sort of look forward. One, of course, is the outcome of the US elections. If Donald Trump wins it, then per Donald Trump, he could get it resolved in 24 hours. Now, leaving aside that hyperbole, or call it what you will, he does have a certain kind of approach to this. Recently, one of his national security advisors, the former General McMaster, has come up with this whole thing about how he appreciates Putin, and how he actually likes Putin, and how he likes strongmen and the rest of it. So that is one, which Matthew is likely to probably draw back much of the US support, and the Europeans will have to step up to the plate. Now, to add to the complexity of the situation, if we look at the election results in France, for instance, and then we look at the election results in states of Germany, where Chancellor Scholz's centrist party is kind of teetering. The Greens may not even make it to 5%, which means they will be completely wiped out. The AfD has done very well, and then the left-wing party has done so. And these are parties that are not particularly keen on supporting Ukraine in this war. So a lot of the political map in Europe is also in a state of flux. How do you think that's likely to impact, Matthew?
I think on Trump, as I wrote in that piece, I don't think he's going to be successful in disentangling all the complexity and forging some sort of agreement, that would also have to be adhered to by Ukraine, but and certainly can't do that in 24 hours. I do think he just because the U.S. has been the biggest supporter of Ukraine, I think he could, and as you rightly say, I mean, the Germany, I think, is key here, that they look like they're also moving in the same direction of less support, that he could change the narrative in the West from this, we will, support Ukraine up to the hilt, whatever they want, we'll be standing there and supporting it, to one where this war has gone on far too long. We need to find some sort of equitable settlement. And that would be, I mean, if I were in Kiev's, I would worry about that scenario. Not that he could get an agreement, but he could change the narrative in the West and start veering off into, the West wants an agreement.
Let me, Mariana, how concerned should the Ukrainians be, and of course it's too early to say, with a Trump win, and even leaving that aside, the political map, or should I say the politico-democratic map of Europe undergoing a change. We've seen that in France. France is stuck. It's in a limbo. One still can't figure out why Macron decided to go for these snap elections after the European Parliament elections. Maybe he thought the result for the national elections will somehow miraculously be different from the European Parliament elections. Anyway, it hasn't really redounded to his advantage or his party's advantage or to the advantage of the centrist elements. So France is stuck. France, in any case, does not really have a good experience of consociational politics like the Netherlands or Belgium or certain other countries. Now we have the German problem. And it's almost like it's not just about about that Game of Thrones phrase, winter is coming. It's more than winter. There's another kind of winter, and Ukraine, for the sustainment of this war, requires external support, period. There are no two ways about that. So how concerned should the Ukrainians be?
Well, it sounds like Ukrainians are concerned, even though perhaps the Zelensky administration is not boasting or is not talking openly about it, because certainly they hope and they will have to find a way to work with the Trump administration if it does happen that Trump is elected in November. So they're trying to be, diplomatic about it. I just want to push back that Ukrainians have been getting whatever they want. That has never been the policy of the Biden administration. Said as long as it takes, and what went unspoken is not with whatever it takes. Every weapon system was a painfully negotiated, long considered and use limited type of affair, even though of course the absolute number of military support is overwhelmingly coming from the United States. If it's an interesting scenario to work out what would happen if Trump becomes president, how it will impact Ukraine and Europe. And those are not two, as you well say, unrelated, entities. Whatever happens to Europe as a result of Trump administration will have consequences for Ukraine. Whatever happens to Ukraine will have consequences for Europe. Trump will likely diminish U.S. leadership in NATO, right? That has its consequences. Who's going to fill in those shoes for NATO? And then, the leadership in Europe will have to be negotiated and figured out. And you mentioned Macron, he's already demonstrated, as much as Ukrainians liked the whole statement about, maybe we'll have to deploy troops, that was clearly not coordinated with any of the allies. And it looked quite silly, when the next day Olaf Scholz comes out and says, no, we agreed to no such thing. So it's these habits of leadership that nobody but the US has in NATO. US would never do something like that without quietly consulting allies before making such big statements, right? And you come out with this kind of impression of unity and so forth. So divesting strategically from Europe is one of the consequences that will have, it's another indirect consequence for Ukraine. Diminishing the support for Ukraine, which might happen if Trump comes in and says, we're giving all these arms, all of this only fuels the war, right? There's a narrative like that, right? The more arms you get, the more war you get. Let's just negotiate something. I mean, it's not a crazy supposition that maybe there will be some ceasefire that's reached, and Ukrainians are in the corner because they know they can't fight without a U.S. support. And if Europe doesn't step in to fill in that void, then the question becomes how sustainable that ceasefire is. And if Trump ties his name to a deal in a ceasefire and then Russians break it, an ego like Trump's might suffer from that, right?
Right. I'm happy that you made this point, because I don't exactly recall the month. It was probably August or September 2022 when the late Dr. Kissinger was at Davos, and he spoke about he said, look, there's going to be ultimately a stalemate, and there's need to go to the negotiating table, because where do you want to draw the line? And during the Cold War, it was the Elbe. Now, is it going to be the Dnipro? And he was roundly condemned by most Ukrainians, including President Zelensky. But now, increasingly, President Zelensky has talked about the fact that the hot war phase might be over at some point. Putin is also looking for some kind of face saver in terms of, I'm assuming, in terms of some kind of negotiations. Of course, he's not going to give away what he has already captured. At which point, I want to refer to 4 scenarios that Matthew has written about. And let's, for the remaining time of the program, discuss those scenarios and see how each can pan out. So one scenario, the first scenario, is a frozen conflict would pose the highest risk for a sudden new outbreak of fighting. The second scenario, a negotiated ceasefire, would reduce the chances of fighting reoccurring, but it would require the endorsement of outside powers, international peacekeepers, and a demilitarized zone. If the ceasefire holds, it would become a basis for an armistice. 3, a Korean-style armistice would likely take years to secure and would require the attainment of a ceasefire. And 4th, general peace settlements have been rare for conflicts since 1950 and would necessitate a wider settlement of Russia-NATO differences. Now, these are the 4 points, and then Matthew has, gone on to explain these 4 points. Just an observation before I ask you to discuss those points. It's ironic that the like over 50, and I'm referring to the 4th point, which is the Russia-NATO settlement. Over 50 top US policymakers, scholars, think tankers wrote then to President Clinton saying, look, this NATO expansion is not a good idea. Even Kennan, who's like the doyen of, and who's one of those people who really knew the Soviet Union / Russia, was opposed to it. And ultimately, after all this trouble, and ultimately after all the violence that has happened, we have to go back to some kind of settlement between Russia and NATO. Matthew, let me begin with you because these are your points. And so if you could elaborate on them, and then I will get Mariana's take on these points.
Well, I didn't just draw these out of my head. I mean, they're based upon a lot of research looking at conflicts, and obviously every conflict is different, but conflicts, internationalized conflicts, and what works when, or what are how to make it work better. I mean, if you actually get to a ceasefire, how to ensure that it actually lasts. I mean, there's a lot of research on that, as well as obviously looking at whether you can ever get to a peace agreement. I think the one thing that, and I'll just make this point, the one thing that we should not assume, particularly when Putin is still around, is that, he is eager to get back into the good books of the West. Mm-hmm. That, he, in his mind, now a future leader I'm not so sure about, but in his mind, they have closed the door. And in talking to a lot of Russians who've been my contacts for years, I mean, they are, who were very oriented towards the West, they are now resigned to much more an orientation towards the East and the South. Mm-hmm. And, if you read, a lot of their work, I mean, they have given up on getting sanctions lifted on Russia. That means that there's less leverage that the West has.
But Matthew, that's the direction.
I actually don't think we can get a peace agreement at this.
No,
first.
I agree with you. I agree with you. But you're saying that they are looking east and south. That's the direction of trade and Russian economy also. So
yes.
Yeah. So okay. So Mariana, these points and one observation from me also. Now, assuming that the external military and financial aid to Ukraine cannot be sustained at that level in, let's say, in the next year or a couple of years, while the Russian economy continues to grow at 4%. Will it be possible for Ukraine to sustain this? I mean, if I were Putin, I would say, well, I can wait this out because I will ultimately be able to just simply tie them out and force them to the negotiating table. I mean, in any case, he is not interested in Ukrainian-speaking or ethnic Ukrainian areas. He doesn't want to have that albatross around his neck. He is only interested in the areas that he's captured and a couple of more oblasts where you have Russian-speaking Ukrainians or ethnic Russians. So he will be content with that, don't you think?
I'm not so sure. I mean, we keep guessing what Putin wants. He wanted to end Ukrainian statehood as such. His first ambition was to take Kiev and put in his own government that would rule over both, Ukrainian and Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And also, these are becoming all the more meaningless distinctions. I mean, those Ukrainians who are suffering the most from Russian aggression are the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Kharkiv, in Odessa, in all these areas, in Dnipro, in Zaporizhia. I was just in Ukraine. I was in Zaporizhia. Zaporizhia is one of the most heavily Russified cities, that had this big industrial city. It was all Russian-speaking. I was just there. It speaks Ukrainian now. On principle, simply because they're 50 miles from the front lines. They know what's happening. So I really don't know if Putin might have his ideas about what he wants and adjusted his ends now to just the Donbass or whatever areas he proclaimed to have annexed, but then he still has some room to fill. The rest of Zaporizhia and the rest of Kherson Oblast, that allegedly is too, according to the Russian constitution, Russian lands that he has claimed. So even if he gets the rest of Donetsk and the rest of Lugansk Oblast, he would be, have pretext to continue military action. Now, with Ukraine losing this support, it certainly is going to be a really bad situation, but it's not just going to end in Ukraine stops fighting and the fighting stops. Right? A lot of it, there's a second side to it, whether Putin will stop fighting. And, as has been said already, he's already decided that any kind of rapprochement with the West is undoable. What is to prevent him from pushing further against a weak Ukraine? And that, again, that's not the end of the story. That's more refugees in Europe. That's more pictures of blood and destruction on Western media. You can ignore it, but there will be pressures on the West to do something from somewhere, or face basically the obliteration of a country. And you brought up the Game of Thrones, Ejaz. It's not that you can just build that wall at the Ukrainian border and whatever's happening over there is not going to have any impact, and you can just man it with a bunch of whatever winter guard. DMZ in between the Koreas is 150 miles. That's not the borders between NATO and Ukraine. That's not even the border along Dnipro or the border along the Ukrainian front. Who's going to freeze it and how? With what force?
Yeah, it's almost 1,000
geography is entirely different. East-West Germany, that border was, and I just looked it up when the two of you were talking, was 1,400 kilometers. It was armed to the teeth. As you well remember, there were hundreds of thousands of troops on both sides, and a wall, keeping the two parts of Berlin apart. It was a very heavily
more like West Berlin being walled in. Which was ironic, because those who were walled in were more free, and those who were outside the wall wanted to get into.
Indeed, to come out. So the geography does play a huge role here, that we need to consider, of how to, even a ceasefire or an armistice, how it will be enforced. You can certainly enforce it on the Ukrainian side by withholding help. How are you going to enforce it on the Russian side? What kind of inducements or, sanctions or repercussions are you going to threaten to prevent Russia from escalating anytime it sees fit? Again, with the recognition that we have a very limited impact on what happens inside Russia, what kind of regime Russia chooses to have. That's up to Russians.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are a number of questions that obviously this discussion has thrown up a number of other questions. And we don't really have answers even for the questions that we have posed here, because there's so much uncertainty. But I think, unfortunately, or let me put it in a different way, for unfortunate reasons, we are likely to be together again to discuss this, because this is unlikely to come to an end anytime soon. But I do believe that this political situation in Europe, in the rest of Europe, will likely play an important role. And the way it's panning out, it seems that it is likely to play more in favor of Russia than in favor of Ukraine. Now, there's another thing also, and I don't know how well the Ukrainian economy can sustain that, but we have seen that the Ukrainian engineers and the Ukrainian army have done a lot of indigenous. I mean, there has been a strong base in Ukraine of developing, researching military hardware. So they've done a lot of these indigenous improvements. So I don't think Ukraine is completely dependent on external help, but definitely more so than Russia. And I think that is also, sustainment is also another factor that is likely to actually sort of, determine, if you will, how this is going to evolve. But thank you so much, Dr. Mariana, Budjeryn, Mathew. This has been excellent. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussion. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.